Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll recognize the shape of most stories we tell here. Man finds the Philippines, finds a woman, loses his savings, loses his dignity, comes home older and poorer, and hopefully wiser. There are variations, but the bones are usually the same. Brendan's story is not quite that shape. Brendan is 67 years old. He's from County Leitrim in the west of Ireland, one of the quieter corners of a quiet country. He spent the better part of his working life underground, mining coal in the Roscommon Hills, and he is not, by any measure, a foolish man. He didn't ignore the warnings. He didn't throw his money around. He moved slowly, checked his footing, and did almost everything right. And still. This one's going to stay with you. Not because of the amount he lost, and we'll get to that, but because of what he was really looking for when he got on that plane, and what he found out about himself when he ran the test. Here's his story, in his own words. Right, where do I start? I suppose I start at Arigna, because everything starts at Arigna. If you're not from that part of Ireland, you won't know it. Small place. Roscommon Hills, up near Lough Allen. There were coal mines there, real working coal mines, which most people don't know Ireland had. Not big by any international standard, but real. Men went underground every day, came up black, went home, went back down. I started at 18. My father had been there before me. His before him. There's a thing about underground work that's hard to explain to people who haven't done it. You develop a very specific kind of attention. You notice things, small things, changes in pressure, in sound, in the way the air sits. You notice them before you can name them, because if you wait until you can name them, you might be dead. That habit of attention, it doesn't leave you. I still have it. I want you to know that about me before I tell you the rest, because the rest might make me sound like a man who wasn't paying attention. I was. I just wasn't paying attention to the right things. The mines closed in 1990. I was 32. They gave us a modest settlement, a handshake, and that was that. I retrained as a maintenance fitter. Machines rather than rock faces, but the same general principle of keeping things from falling apart. Worked at a packaging plant outside Carrick-on-Shannon for the next 20 years. Nothing glamorous, steady work. I was good at it. Retired at 62. State pension, a small industry pension from the miners' scheme, and whatever I'd saved over the years, which was a fair bit, because I've never been one for waste. The house was paid off. Nothing owed to anyone. The house, 2 bedrooms, end of a terrace on the edge of town. I've lived in it since 1986, and if you opened the front room curtains, you'd see curtains that Marie chose. That's the wife. Was the wife. Marie left in 2001. Went off with a man from Sligo she'd met at a cousin's wedding, which is the sort of thing that happens, and then becomes the sentence that defines the next 20 years of your life, whether you want it to or not. She left in January. I never moved them. The curtains. Not because I'm sentimental, I don't think. Just because they were there, and it didn't occur to me to change them, and then enough time passed that changing them started to seem like a statement. And I didn't want to make a statement. We'd been married since 1983. No children that survived, which was its own grief, separate from the other grief, and I won't go into it here. When she left, I was 43. I thought, well, that's something I'll have to sort out. Find someone else. Or not. We'll see. We saw. 22 years alone in that house, more or less. Not miserable. I want to be clear about that. I had my routine. Morning walk down by the river, the news, a pint at Keenigan on a Friday if the weather wasn't vile, which in Leitrim is not a given. Mass on Sunday. My sister Orla in Boyle rang every couple of weeks. My nephew Sharon, her youngest, used to come for the football sometimes. It was a life. It was accounted for. I'd stopped noticing the silence the way you stop noticing tinnitus. It was just there, part of the texture of the place. I want to say I started watching videos about the Philippines for practical reasons. Retirement research, cost of living, sensible planning. And there is some truth in that. I was retired. I was interested in where a pension could stretch further. And the Philippines kept coming up. But I'll also admit it was 11:30 on a Tuesday night in November. The rain was hammering the window. There was nothing on the telly worth watching. And I ended up on YouTube clicking from one thing to another the way you do. A man showing his apartment in Cebu for 12,000 pesos a month. Another man eating grilled fish on a beach somewhere in Bohol. Another man walking through a market in Dumaguete, describing the price of vegetables. I watched for 2 hours. Then I watched the next night. And the night after that, I told myself I was researching. The way a man standing outside an estate agent's window tells himself he's just looking. I booked a 3-week trip the following spring. 65 years old, never been to Asia, never been further than a package holiday to Lanzarote since Marie left. I stayed in a guest house in Lahug. I'd found it through a forum, decent reviews, run by a local family. Nothing fancy. I remember landing in Cebu and stepping outside the terminal, and the heat it hit me like opening a furnace door. I mean that as a compliment. I hadn't been warm, properly warm, in years. The city was noisier than I expected, more chaotic. Jeepneys everywhere, tricycles cutting across traffic, horns going constantly. I won't pretend I wasn't disoriented for the first few days. I was. But it wasn't unpleasant. I did the things tourists do. Visited the Basilica del Santo Niño, genuinely old, genuinely impressive. The kind of place that reminds you that Catholic guilt travels well across cultures. Went to Magellan's Cross, found a carinderia near the guest house where I ate most of my meals. Tapped fish and rice, 50 pesos. Some sort of vegetable dish whose name I never learned to pronounce. The woman who ran it found my accent confusing. We got on fine. 3 weeks. I came home quieter than I left. I can't fully explain that. Nothing dramatic happened. But something had shifted, some small calibration. The silence in the house felt different when I got back. Not worse, exactly. Just more visible. I booked a second trip for the following January. 5 weeks this time. And that trip is where this story really begins. The second trip felt different from the moment I landed. Not the place. The place was the same. Same heat, same noise, same smell of exhaust, and something frying somewhere just out of sight. But I was different in it. Less disoriented. I knew where I was going, and roughly how to get there. And that changes everything about how a place feels. I'd booked a small apartment this time rather than the guest house. Month-to-month rental in a building off Governor Cuenco. Nothing special. Ceiling fan, decent Wi-Fi, a little balcony where you could sit in the evening and listen to the neighborhood. There was a sari-sari store on the corner run by a woman who seemed to be there at every hour of the day, and a basketball court 20 meters away that had games going from 7 in the morning until after dark. I never figured out when anyone slept. I settled into a routine the way I do. Morning coffee at a place on the main road, walk, read. Sometimes a jeepney somewhere just to see a different part of the city. I'm not a man who needs much entertainment. Quiet suits me. And Cebu, once you get away from Colon Street and the main shopping strips, has quiet places if you know to look for them. The expat group came about gradually. I'd seen the same few foreign faces in the same coffee shop in Consolacion 3 or 4 mornings running, and eventually one of them, a Dutch fellow named Peter, retired engineer, had worked on infrastructure projects across Southeast Asia for 30 years, nodded and said there was a seat free at his table if I wanted it. That was that. There were 4 of us, more or less regularly. Peter, an Australian named Ray, who'd been in Cebu for 12 years and knew everyone and everything, or said he did. A German man whose name I always mangled and who didn't seem to mind. And me. We weren't close, exactly. It was more like the kind of male friendship that exists around a shared routine. You sit together. You talk about things. You don't dig too deep. It was fine. It was something. Ray was the one who knew everyone. He'd introduce you to people, pass information along, seemed to have his finger in various pies, none of which I ever fully understood. It was Ray who mentioned the Sunday lunch. A group of people, some expats, some local, casual, a restaurant near the waterfront in Mandaue that did decent seafood. Did I want to come? I did. I want to describe that lunch clearly, because I've thought about it a lot since. There were maybe 12 people at the long table, various nationalities, a few Filipino women, friends or colleagues of someone or other. I wasn't sure of the exact relationships. The food was good. Grilled bangus, some kind of prawn dish, rice, San Miguel going around the table. It was a Sunday. The sun was doing what the sun does in Cebu. Rowena was at the far end of the table. Ray had mentioned her in passing on the walk over. Said she was a friend of a friend. Worked in logistics. Sensible woman. He said it in a way that suggested he wasn't trying to set anything up. And I believed him. And that was probably part of why one relaxed. I don't respond well to people engineering things. She was 41. She looked it, not in a harsh way, just in the way of a woman who'd done actual work in her life and wasn't pretending otherwise. She was from Tagbilaran, in Bohol, originally, but had been in Cebu for nearly 15 years. She had a directness about her. She didn't perform anything for the table. We didn't speak much at lunch. She was 3 seats away, and the conversation at a table of 12 doesn't flow neatly. But at some point towards the end, when the group had broken into smaller conversations, she looked across and asked me where I was from. I told her Leitrim. She'd never heard of it. Fair enough. I described it. Small, rural, west of Ireland, wetter than anywhere you've ever been. She asked what I'd done there. I said I'd worked in the mines, Arigna. And her face did something that faces don't usually do when I say that, which is show genuine interest. She asked, how deep? She asked what you do when your lamp goes. She asked if men were ever afraid. I don't know how long we talked. Long enough that Peter caught my eye at some point and raised an eyebrow. I ignored him. Nobody had asked me about the mines in years. My sister knew about them, but they were just background by now, just where Brendan came from, the way you stop seeing the furniture in your own house. And here was a woman I'd met 40 minutes ago asking what it felt like to work underground. And I found myself actually trying to answer properly, not giving the short version. Thinking about it while I spoke. It's a strange thing when someone makes you think about your own life by asking about it. She had to leave. She was meeting her sister. She said it was nice to talk to me, and she meant it, or at least it read that way, and then she was gone. Ray was grinning on the walk back to the car. I told him to cut it out. He cut it out and kept grinning. He gave me her number that evening via a WhatsApp message. Added a note saying she'd said it was fine to pass it along if I wanted to be in touch. I stared at that message for a while. Then I saved the number and didn't do anything with it for 3 days. Not because I wasn't interested, because that's how I operate. I wanted to be sure of what I was doing before I did it. I sent her a message on a Wednesday afternoon, said it was good to talk at the weekend, and I'd enjoyed hearing about Bohol. That was all. She replied within the hour, said she'd looked up Leitrim, said it looked cold. I said that was a generous way to describe it. That was the start of it. I had 2 more weeks left on that trip. We met for coffee twice, a place she liked near her office in the Mandaue business district, small and not especially nice, but apparently the coffee was worth it. We walked once along the reclamation area in the evening. I brought pasalubong when I met her the second time, some biscuits from a bakery near my apartment, which she seemed to find funny and also genuinely appreciated. She told me later that the fact I'd heard of pasalubong at all had impressed her. Peter had briefed me. I didn't tell her that. It wasn't, I don't know how to describe what it was. It wasn't romantic exactly. Not yet. It was 2 people finding that they could talk easily, which is rarer than it sounds, and which I hadn't experienced in a long time. She was straightforward. She said what she thought. She didn't flatter me or make me feel like I was the most interesting man she'd ever met. She treated me more or less as a normal person, which sounds like a low bar, and, in my experience, is not. I flew home at the end of January. We exchanged numbers. I didn't make any promises. She didn't ask for any. On the flight back, somewhere over the Middle East, I found myself thinking about what she'd asked about the lamps. What you do when your lamp goes underground? The answer is, you stay still and you wait for your eyes to adjust. And if they don't adjust, you feel your way by the walls. And you don't panic, because panic costs air. I thought about that for a while. Then I slept. I got back to Leitrim in early February. The house was the same. The curtains were the same. The river was running high from the winter rain, and the walk I did every morning felt the same as it had for years. Same route, same birds, same mud on the path past the 3rd gate. But I found myself doing something I hadn't done before. I'd come in from the walk, put the kettle on, and I'd check my phone. Not because I was expecting anything urgent. There's never anything urgent for me. I checked because there was usually a message from Rowena. She sent them in the mornings her time, which was evenings mine. Just small things, how her day had gone, something her nephew John had said, a photo of her lunch from the canteen at work. Sinangag and a fried egg, usually, or some sinigang from a pot her mother had sent. She didn't ask me questions that required long answers. She didn't press for anything. She just kept in touch, the way a person does when they're genuinely interested, rather than performing interest. I know how that sounds coming from a man my age, about a woman he'd met twice over a few hours. I know, but I'd spent 22 years being very good at reading rooms and people. You had to be, underground, and it carries over. And she didn't read to me like someone working an angle. We moved to video calls in March. Her idea, actually. She said texting was fine, but she wanted to see my face when I talked, because apparently I had a face that showed more than my words did. I told her that was an unusual way to describe someone, and she said she meant it as a compliment. I wasn't sure. We called twice a week at first. By April, it was most evenings. I want to be transparent with you watching this, because I think it matters. I'd been told by Ray, and by Peter, and by a forum or 2 I'd read, what the patterns looked like. The escalating requests, the sick mother, the siblings' school fees, the jeepney driver cousin who needed $5,000 to fix his engine. I had a list in my head, more or less, of how it was supposed to go. And I was watching for it. Not in an unfriendly way, I hope. But I was watching. None of it appeared. She had her own phone, paid her own bill, never once asked me to top up her load. She had a salary, not a large one, but real. From a real company with a real address I'd looked up on the internet, which I did, yes, without telling her. The logistics firm was legitimate. I checked. Then in May, she mentioned, almost in passing at the end of a call, that her mother needed a tooth out and possibly some other work, and the dentist in Tagbilaran was quoting $18,000, about $450, and that she was going to have to budget carefully that month, but it would be fine. She moved on to something else. Didn't wait for a response. Didn't circle back. I sent the P18,000 via Wise the next morning. Just transferred it to the G cash number she'd mentioned in an earlier conversation as her mother's. Sent her a message saying I'd sorted it. She called me 20 minutes later. Not gushing, not performing gratitude. She said simply that she hadn't been asking. I said I knew. She said thank you, and she meant it in the quiet way that means more than the loud way. I've thought about that moment. Whether it was calculated. Mention the problem. Don't ask. Wait for him to offer. Which is in some ways more effective than asking directly, because it makes the man feel like the decision was his. I've considered it. I can't rule it out. But I also know that the alternative explanation is simply that she had a mother with a bad tooth, mentioned it to the person she was talking to every day, and didn't ask for money because she didn't feel entitled to ask. Both things are possible. I chose to believe the second one. I still think it was the right reading. I'm less sure it was the right choice. We kept talking. She'd been the eldest of 4, she told me. An older brother who'd moved to Manila for work. A younger sister. A youngest brother, Danilo, who did delivery work around Tagbilaran. Their father had died when Rowena was 23. She'd been the one who held things together after that, quietly, without naming it as sacrifice. The eldest daughter. I'd later come to understand more about what that means in a Filipino family, the weight of it, the assumption that the eldest carries the others forward. It's not manipulation. It's just how things are organized there, and have been for a long time. Rowena had grown up shaped by it, the way I'd grown up shaped by the mines. You don't question the structure, you just work within it. The nephew, Jonjon, was her younger sister's boy, 15, studying at a public school in Tagbilaran, serious about physics and engineering in a way that surprised people because the school didn't have much to offer him. Rowena mentioned him often, not asking anything, just telling me about him the way you tell someone about a person you're proud of. I asked her once what he needed. She said better textbooks, mainly, and someone to tell him it was worth the effort. I thought, I could do the first one easily enough. I didn't say that out loud. By September, I'd booked the third trip. 3 months this time, January to March. An apartment in Mandaue, arranged through a letting agent Peter knew. 2-bedroom place on the 4th floor, $22,000 a month, about $350, with a washing machine and a view of a car park and a Jollibee on the street below. I was 66 years old, and I was going to the Philippines for 3 months to see where things stood with a woman I'd met at a Sunday lunch. I knew exactly how that read. I did it anyway. I told Orla in October. Rang her on a Sunday after Mass, which is when we always talk. I explained about Rowena. Sensible, intelligent, Catholic, 41, works in logistics, from Bohol. Orla listened all the way through without interrupting, which is not her usual style. When I finished, there was a pause. Then she said she hoped I knew what I was doing. I said I thought so. Another pause. She said to mind myself. And that was that. She didn't say it was a bad idea. She didn't say it was a good one. She just looked at me with her voice, the way sisters do, and I felt it across 200 kilometers, and a phone line, and got on with booking the flights. I arrived in Mandoy on a Thursday in January, which I mention only because Rowena was working and couldn't meet me until the weekend, so I had 2 days to get the apartment sorted and settle myself in before any of it became real. The place was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of concrete and cooking oil in the lift, and was perfectly fine once you opened the windows. The car park view I'd been warned about. The Jollibee below I had not anticipated. They close late, and there's a particular quality to Jollibee at midnight that you can't fully prepare for. A cheerfulness that carries upward through the floor, whether you want it to or not. But it was mine, temporarily, and I was glad of it. Rowena came on the Saturday. We went to a Mang Inasal near the SM City Cebu for lunch. Her choice. She said she'd been craving the chicken and rice for weeks. I had the same. We sat across from each other and talked for 2 hours, and it was, if anything, easier in person than it had been on the calls, which surprised me. There's a version of this story where everything deflates when you're finally face to face. That wasn't my experience. She was the same woman. More present, obviously, but the same. She had her own apartment in the Labangan area of Cebu City, a 30-minute grab ride from mine. She kept her own life during the week. Work, her routines, her sister who lived nearby. She came to Mandaue on Saturdays, sometimes stayed Sunday, went back Monday morning. I want to be specific about this because it mattered to me. She wasn't installing herself. She had her own place, her own money coming in, her own schedule. That structure read to me as healthy, as evidence of a person who wasn't desperate. I think about that now. Whether I confused self-containment with trustworthiness, they're not the same thing. Her sister Marites came to lunch in the second week. A small place on MC Briones Street that Rowena liked, Turo style, point at what you want, very simple. Marites was 36, quieter than Rowena, with a way of watching you that reminded me of certain foremen I'd worked under. Not hostile, just assessing. She and Rowena spoke Bisaya between themselves for stretches, which I expected and didn't mind. You're a stranger walking into a family. You should expect to be looked at carefully. Her mother, Nanay Chita, came from Tagbilaran the following weekend. 68 years old, small, dressed as though church was always a possibility. Rowena had clearly prepared her. She shook my hand and called me Brendan, not Kano, which I gathered later was a small but deliberate courtesy. We ate at the apartment. Rowena cooked. Chicken adobo and rice. A vegetable dish I couldn't name. Fruit from the market. Nanay Sita said grace before the meal, and meant every word of it. I don't know what I'd been expecting exactly. Something more transactional, maybe. Instead, I found a small family having a Sunday meal, and I was the guest who'd funded the mother's dental work 4 months earlier, which I suspected created a particular kind of obligation in this cultural context, and which I was careful not to use as leverage in any direction. I was there. I was polite. I ate the food and said it was good, which was true. It was in the 2nd month that Danilo came up in conversation. Her younger brother, the delivery work, the rented motorbike I mentioned he used, he was paying $500 a day in rental fees, which over a month was $15,000 out of whatever he earned, and a second-hand Honda in reasonable condition could be had for $35,000, about $875. She mentioned this while we were walking along the Mandaue Coastal Road in the evening. Not a pitch. More like she was telling me something she'd been turning over and hadn't figured out a solution to. I said I'd sort it. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded. That's all she did. Nodded. Which was the right response, I thought at the time. Not grateful, tearful, not immediately planning the purchase. Just a nod that said, yes, that would help. I transferred the money to Danilo's Gcash directly, which Rowena gave me without me having to ask for it. The bike was bought within a week. Rowena sent me a photo of Danilo with it, standing outside the family house in Tagbilaran. He looked pleased. He should have. It was a decent bike. I didn't feel used. I want to be clear about that. I felt useful. And there's a difference, and I knew the difference, and the way it felt was the second thing. I'd been retired for 4 years. I'd had no one depending on me for anything since Marie left, and arguably before that, because we'd long since stopped being people each other needed. And here was a clear problem with a clear solution, and I had the money and it mattered to someone. That feeling is not nothing. At 66, after 22 years in a quiet house, it is quite a lot. The trip to Bohol came at the end of February. Rowena had been wanting me to see where she was from, and we took the ferry from the Pier 1 terminal. 2 hours across the water to Tagbilaran, the sea very flat that morning. Cargo boats and smaller banca boats in the distance. The province is different from Cebu. Slower. More space between things. We drove to the family house in a barangay outside the town, a concrete building with a small garden and a mango tree that had clearly been there a long time. Jonjan was there. Rowena had told me about him for months, and I'd built a picture in my head that was mostly accurate. 15 years old, slight, serious expression, the kind of quiet that isn't shyness but attention. He was sitting at the table with a physics textbook that was 2 years out of date and had been used by at least one previous student before him. I could see the pencil marks from another hand in the margins. I asked him what they were studying. Mechanics, he said. Forces and motion. He showed me the problem set he was working through. I'm not a physicist, but I know how machines work. And forces and motion are forces and motion whether you're underground or in a classroom. And we talked for 40 minutes about it, while Rowena and her mother did something in the kitchen, and the smell of tinalang manok came through from the back of the house. Jonjan answered my questions carefully, like someone who'd learned to be measured about what he knew in case he was wrong. I told him he understood the material better than he thought he did. He looked at me with the polite skepticism of a 15-year-old who's been underestimated. I thought, someone should back this kid. I didn't say anything to Rowena that evening, but I thought it. The proposal happened 10 days before I was due to fly home. Not a planned occasion. We were sitting on the balcony of the Mandaue apartment, early evening, a San Miguel each, the car park below, the Jollibee sign lit up in orange. I'd been thinking about it for the better part of 6 weeks. I'm 66, I thought. The house in Leitrim has Marie's curtains on the windows. Rowena is a sensible woman who asks good questions and doesn't make scenes and has the same general approach to life that I do, which is to get on with things without too much ceremony. So I said, I think we should get married. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought so too. No crying, no dramatic declaration. Just 2 people in their 60s. Well, she was 41, but she had an older temperament, agreeing that the thing that made sense was the thing they were going to do. I wasn't being a fool. I was being logical. That's the part one still chew on. I flew home to Leitrim in late March and spent the following months doing the kind of paperwork that makes a thing real in ways that a conversation on a balcony doesn't. An overseas marriage involving an Irish citizen requires documentation, civil status certificates, proof of capacity to marry, authenticated copies of various things through the Philippine Statistics Authority. Rowena had her side to handle, I had mine. We worked through it on separate ends over video calls, her consulting her HR department for some of it, me ringing the civil registration office in Roscommon more times than either of us would have wished. I went to the solicitor in Carrick in May. Not because I was worried, specifically. Because I'm careful. I told him what I was planning, gave him the broad shape of it. He asked a few routine questions. Did I intend to transfer property? Did I intend to invest in any business venture there? Had I considered a cohabitation agreement? I said no to all of it. The house in Leitrim was mine, and would remain mine. The savings were in my account, and would remain in my account. I wasn't building a house on her family's land, which I knew from everything I'd read was one of the quickest ways to lose a significant sum with no legal recourse, since foreigners can't own land in the Philippines, and anything built on land you don't own belongs to whoever does. He seemed satisfied, or at least he stopped asking questions, which, with solicitors, amounts to the same thing. I told Syaran, my nephew, over a pint in June. He's 26. He thought it was brilliant. Said Rowena sounded sound and that I deserved something good. I appreciated that. He asked if he could come to the wedding. I said we'd see. Orla rang the following Sunday. I'm not sure who told her. Possibly Kyaran. Possibly she'd simply waited long enough. She was measured about it. Not cold. Just careful. The way you are when you're worried about someone you love, and you know they'll dig in if you push. She asked if I'd spoken to a solicitor. I said I had. She asked about the visa process. I explained it. Spousal visa to Ireland. Should take 8 to 10 months after the wedding. She'd continue working in Cebu in the meantime. Orla said she hoped I knew what I was doing. Again. I said I did. Again. We moved on to other things. I flew back to Bohol in August for the wedding. The ceremony was in Rowena's parish church in Tagbilaran, the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, a substantial old building in the center of town that had survived several centuries and a significant earthquake, and looked like it intended to survive several more. I'd asked Rowena whether she'd prefer a civil ceremony, and she said she'd prefer the church, if I didn't object, and I didn't object. I was raised Catholic. I lapsed somewhere around 1995, but the form of it is still familiar. The smell of the incense, the particular acoustics of old stone, the way a congregation quietens when the doors close. There were 60 guests, mostly her family, aunts, cousins, neighbors from the barangay, colleagues from work. Ray came over from Cebu, which I was glad of. Peter sent a message saying he was sorry he couldn't make it and wishing us well. 4 of Rowena's colleagues made up the remainder of the international contingent, which is to say everyone else was Filipino, and I was aware of being the only person in the church who needed portions of the ceremony translated. The priest spoke in a mix of Filipino and English and Cebuano, which I found more linguistically ambitious than most Irish weddings I'd attended. The ceremony was longer than I was used to, more expressive. People in the pews cried openly, not out of sadness, just out of the way Filipinos cry at weddings, which is freely and without embarrassment, which I found unexpectedly moving. There's something about being in a room where people aren't managing their emotions that reaches you, whether you're inclined to cry yourself or not. I wasn't, but I felt it. Nanay Sita gave a speech at the reception. It was held in a function room on the edge of town, a long room with good acoustics and a sound system someone's cousin clearly operated with enthusiasm. There was lechon on the table, which people had been anticipating, and which was, objectively, remarkable. Pancit noodles, rice, lumpia, more food than 60 people could eat. The mother's speech was in Cebuano. Rowena translated fragments for me in real time, leaning close so I could hear over the music. Something about God's plan. Something about the years Rowena had carried the family, and how it was right that she should have someone to stand beside her now. Something about welcoming me into the family, which the mother said not as a formality, but as a statement of actual intention, looking directly at me when Rowena translated it. I took it seriously. I want to be clear about that. Nanay Sita meant what she said. The family's expectations of me were real, and probably larger than I fully understood at the time, but they came from a genuine place. I don't think I was being welcomed cynically. I think I was being welcomed. The complexity of what that welcome eventually meant in practice. That's a different question. Total cost of the wedding, $120,000, approximately $3,000. Venue, food, flowers, the small band for the reception. I paid all of it without discussion. It seemed right. It was right, I think. Or at least not wrong. A man who turns up to marry a woman in her own country and expects her family to share the cost of the celebration is a man with a misplaced sense of how things work. Running total across everything, the dental contribution, the motorbike, the wedding, plus miscellaneous gifts and expenses across 4 trips over 2 years. Roughly $370,000, or about $5,800. That's what I'd spent. Not reckless, not even especially generous by the standards of what these situations often become. I applied for Rowena's spousal visa to Ireland through the Irish Naturalization and Immigration Service the week after the wedding. Submitted the paperwork, paid the fee, was told to expect a decision in 8 to 10 months. Rowena would stay in Cebu, keep working. I would go home. We would continue calling. I flew back to Leitrim in late August. The house was quiet when I came in. Same walls, same furniture, same curtains in the front room. I put my bag down in the hallway and stood there for a moment. But the quiet was different this time. It had always been a closed quiet, contained, sealed, going nowhere. This was a quiet with a date on it. 8 to 10 months. Then she'd be here. Then the spare bedroom would have someone in it, and the kitchen would have 2 sets of plates in use. And the front room curtains could be changed, or not changed with someone else having an opinion about it. I made a cup of tea and rang Orla and told her it was done. She said good. She said she hoped we'd be happy. She meant it. I believed her and was grateful. I was, in those weeks after the wedding, as close to settled as I'd been in 23 years. That's not nothing. Even now, with everything that came after, I don't discount it. I was 66 years old, and for the first time in a very long time, something was coming. I'd let myself believe that. The calls continued after the wedding, same as before. Her mornings, my evenings. We talked about small things, her work, the visa paperwork, what Yonjan was studying that term. She'd started addressing me differently in front of her family. Not Brendan, but something closer to a title. The way Filipinos fold a husband into the household language, and I noticed it, and didn't say anything about it because I didn't know what to say. It felt, I don't know, it felt like a door opening. Then, around October, something changed. Not dramatically. I want to be careful here because dramatic is the wrong word, and it would give the wrong impression. It was more like a shift in barometric pressure, the kind of thing you notice before you can explain it. She started being vague about her weekends. Not evasive. I want to be precise about the difference. Evasive is when someone deflects a specific question. Vague is when the detail just isn't there anymore. Before the wedding, if I asked what she'd done on a Saturday, she'd tell me, went to Ayala with Maritis, had lunch at a place they liked near the IT park, walked home because it wasn't too hot. Specific. After the wedding, it became out with friends. Just friends. Nice day. I noted it. Didn't say anything. That's my way. Then there was a dinner. She mentioned it on a Tuesday call, a work dinner, a male colleague, someone called Renz from the operations team. Very casual, just a few people from the office at some place in Cebu IT Park. Fine. I said fine. But she didn't mention Renz again after that, which was itself a kind of mention. And a call she cut short one Friday evening, saying she was tired, which she sometimes was, genuinely. But there was something in the way she said it. A flatness. I sat with it. 3 weeks, I sat with it. Testing whether the unease was real or constructed. Whether I was being a careful man or a frightened one. The two can look identical from the inside. Underground, you learned to trust the feeling that something was off, because the ceiling doesn't care about your feelings, only about physics. But you also learned not to bolt at shadows, because shadows are mostly just shadows. After 3 weeks, it hadn't gone. It had compounded. So I did what a careful man does. I gathered information before I drew conclusions. I want to explain this part properly, because some people, when I've described it, have said it was underhand. Maybe so, but I'd spent 30 years underground, where you checked the gas readings before you trusted the air, and I wasn't inclined to stop doing that now. I created a profile on Filipino Cupid. I used a photo of Kieran, my nephew. He's 26. Decent looking, and I rang him before I did it and told him there was something I needed to explain. He said, go ahead and use it. He didn't ask too many questions. He's a good lad. The profile, a Canadian named Patrick, 52 years old, recently divorced, worked in project management, considering relocating to the Philippines. I wrote a plausible backstory, the kind of thing that reads as ordinary and real because it is ordinary and real, just not about a real person. I've written procedure manuals and maintenance logs and equipment reports for 30 years. Writing a convincing fake dating profile is not a fundamentally different skill. I set the location filter to Cebu City, age range 40 to 45. Then I searched. I found her in 4 minutes. Her profile was active within the last 30 days. I know that because the platform shows it. 30 days. We'd been married for 8 weeks. Most of the photos I recognized, ones she'd used on WhatsApp, a photo from a family event I'd seen before, but one I didn't recognize. Newer. Taken at an angle she'd never used in any photo she'd sent me. Slightly from above. The light different. Taken by someone else or in a mirror in a way she hadn't done before. A careful person notices these things. A careless person doesn't. I sent a message as Patrick. Friendly, brief, said her profile caught his attention. She replied within 2 hours. Over the following week we exchanged messages. Patrick and Rowena. She was warm, engaged, curious, the same qualities I'd valued in her, being directed at a fictional Canadian with a borrowed face. Patrick asked whether she was currently seeing anyone. She said she'd been in something, but it was complicated. Complicated. I read that word 4 or 5 times. I'm not sure why I kept reading it. It's not a long word. It doesn't have any tricky syllables. But it was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I felt every bit of it. Over the following days, she told Patrick that the man she was with was older, kind, a bit boring, that she was basically separated from him at this point, that she was open to something new. Patrick asked if she'd want to video call sometime. She said yes. I closed the app. I sat in the kitchen. It was 9:30 in the evening. The heating had come on, and the house was warm, and the front room curtains were just visible through the doorway. Marie's curtains, I noticed them the way you notice something you stopped seeing years ago. Really noticed. The pattern and the color and the particular fold they'd settled into over 23 years of hanging. I sat there for a long time. I didn't call Orla, didn't call Kieran, didn't do anything that evening. Just sat. The next morning I opened my real account on the app, took a screenshot of Patrick's conversation with Rowena, and sent it to her in a WhatsApp message. No text, just the image. She rang within 3 minutes. I let it ring out. She rang again. And again. I counted 11 calls in total across that evening, spaced out at intervals that suggested she was trying to find the right moment to stop, or the right words to lead with, or possibly just hoping that eventually I'd pick up and give her the chance to explain. Complicated. I never picked up. The messages came after the calls stopped. Long ones, then shorter ones, then a few that were just my name. I read them all once, that first night. Then I put the phone face down on the kitchen table and didn't look at it again until morning. I want to be honest about something. There was a version of this. I could feel it there, available to me, where I picked up the phone, let her explain, found some interpretation of complicated that I could live with. Some men in my situation would have done that, would have needed the conversation, needed her to cry and deny so they'd have something to push against, a reason to stay or a reason to go that someone else had provided. I didn't do that. Not because I'm cold, or at least I don't think that's why. Because I'd been careful about everything else, the money, the paperwork, the legal questions, the property law, all of it. And this was the one area where I could still choose to be careful. If I let her talk, she'd be skilled enough to give me doubt. And doubt, for a man my age who'd already let himself believe something, is more dangerous than certainty. Certainty at least has a fixed address. I went to the solicitor in Carrick that week. Same man who'd seen me in May about the pre-wedding questions. I told him what had happened in broad terms. No detail, just the shape of it. I asked about the Irish legal position. He confirmed that the marriage was valid in Irish law, properly registered, nothing irregular in the documentation. I thanked him. I withdrew the spousal visa application through the INIS online portal that afternoon. It had been running for roughly 10 weeks and hadn't progressed to the interview stage yet. The withdrawal was straightforward. I don't know what happens on her end when an application is withdrawn, whether she was notified, what the system sends. I didn't think about it for long. The financial accounting was easier than the other kind. I went through my bank records over a cup of tea. The dental contribution, $18,000, about $450. The motorbike, $35,000, about $875. The wedding, $120,000, about $3,000. Flights across 4 trips, accommodation, day-to-day expenses, a few gifts. I estimated the remainder at about $1,375. Total, roughly $5,800 in direct contributions, and the rest brings it to around $6,700 all told. I wrote that number down on a piece of paper and looked at it. What I hadn't lost, no house built on family land, because I'd known not to do that. No business invested in, no property transferred, no large sums moved on the strength of emergencies or promises. The house build conversation hadn't happened yet. I'd felt it taking shape, the way you feel the next question before someone asks it, but we'd never got there. The full weight of the thing, the entanglement that can reach into a man's savings and his legal status and his relationships back home and leave him with nothing recoverable. That machinery hadn't fully engaged. I'd been, by accident or by the instinct of a careful man, not quite far enough in. By the standards of what these situations become, 6,700 euros is a manageable loss. I know that. I'm not asking for sympathy on the money. I rang Orla on a Sunday, said I had something to tell her. Told her. She listened without interrupting, same as she'd done before. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said she was sorry. Not, I told you so, not I knew it, just, I'm sorry. I was more grateful for that than I knew how to say. So I said thanks, and we talked about other things. Ciaran I told in person, over a pint. He already knew part of it. the photo, the profile. I told him the rest. He sat back in his chair and said the word that 26-year-olds say when something is clearly terrible, which is a single profanity deployed with feeling. Then he said he was sorry too. Then he said he was glad I'd found out before she came here. I said yes. He asked if I was all right. I said I thought so. I think about John sometimes, the 15-year-old with the physics textbook. That's not something I've fully put down yet. He had nothing to do with any of it, and he deserved someone to back him, and probably nobody will. I don't know what to do with that. I just carry it. And then there's the harder accounting. The thing that isn't in any bank statement. I'd spent 23 years fairly certain, at some level I never examined directly, that Marie had left because I wasn't quite enough. Not bad enough to justify a big departure, just insufficient. The kind of man a woman outgrows the way you outgrow a town. I'd lived with that, the way I'd lived with the tinnitus. You stop noticing it, but it's still there. When I went to the Philippines, I told myself I was doing something practical. Retirement research, sensible planning. And when I met Rowena, I told myself I was being careful, methodical, the same man I'd always been. Which was true. But underneath the method, there was a question I'd been carrying for 23 years. The test I ran on her wasn't really about Rowena. It was about that question. I needed to know if a woman, having known me properly, having been given every reason to stay, would stay. She didn't. She called the man she'd married older, kind, a bit boring. She said she was basically separated from him. She agreed to a video call with a fictional Canadian. So now I know. That's the answer. And knowing has a weight to it, but it also has a kind of clarity that hoping doesn't. I'm still in Leitrim. The morning walks, the river, the pint in Keenigan on a Friday, Mass on Sunday, Orla ringing every couple of weeks. The same life, accounted for in the same way. The curtains are still up. Marie's curtains in the front room. I've thought about changing them. I even looked at some options online, which is further than I'd gone before. I haven't done anything about it yet, but I've looked. That's something. And if you're watching this because you're planning a trip, or you're already talking to someone and it's going well, and you can feel yourself starting to believe, I'm not here to tell you not to go. The Philippines is worth going to. There are genuine people there. Genuine connections are possible. I believe that. What I'd say is this. Before you go, before you send the first message, before you book the ticket, know what question you're carrying. Know what you've been waiting 20 years to have answered. Because the place will answer it, one way or another. And you'd be better served knowing what the question is before the answer arrives. That's all I have. The host returns to address you directly. Brendan lost $6,700. By the numbers this story tells, that's a modest loss. No house half built on land he doesn't own. No savings drained through a year of monthly transfers. No legal status complications. No property dispute with no remedy. He caught it early, and he got out clean, or as clean as these things get. But you've heard enough of his story to know that clean isn't quite the right word. We want to be careful about how we describe Rowena, because the picture is genuinely complicated, and not in the way she meant when she used that word to Patrick. A 41-year-old woman in Cebu, supporting her family, working a clerk's salary, being courted by an Irish pensioner 26 years older than her. What did she see when she looked at that situation? Probably some genuine liking. She did ask him about the mines, after all, and that wasn't nothing. And also, probably, a man who would eventually leave or die, and a need to keep options open, and a culture that has a word for resourcefulness that doesn't always translate cleanly as admirable or dishonest. She wasn't a villain. She was a person making calculations in difficult circumstances. That's not a defense. It's a complication. The catfish method, which Brendan used, is more common than most people discuss openly. And what it produces is unambiguous in a way that other discoveries rarely are. There's no misreading a screenshot. There's no alternative interpretation of basically separated. The screenshot is the screenshot. If there's a practical lesson from this one, it's the one Brendan gave you himself. Watch the patterns everyone tells you to watch for. They're real. The loan requests, the medical emergencies, the motorbike brothers. They happen and they matter. But the pattern nobody puts in the warning videos is the one you carry through the departure gate. The specific wound that makes you susceptible, not to any woman in particular, but to the idea of being chosen. Know that wound before you board the plane. Thank you for being here with us at Inside the Philippines. If this story reached you, if it made you think about someone you know, or a decision you're weighing, share it. Leave a comment below. The conversation in the comments on this channel matters, and the people who've been through versions of this story are generous with what they've learned. We're grateful for every one of you watching. Take care of yourselves.